Good afternoon, everyone. It's such a pleasure to have you joining us today for what I hope will be a continued engagement and a discussion together on transforming workplaces for equity-deserving learners. My name is Anne-Marie Fannin, and I'm the director of the WorkLearn Institute here at the University of Waterloo. A couple of housekeeping items before we begin. Closed captioning and live transcription have both been enabled for this session. So to use these features, click on the Show Captions button at the bottom of the Zoom window. Also, we'll be hosting Q&A at the end of the presentation. So if you have any questions as we go through the presentation or at the end, please feel free to write them in the Q&A window, which can be opened by selecting Q&A from the bottom of your Zoom window. Before we go any further, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm presenting to you today from the traditional territory of the Neutral, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples, and I respectfully acknowledge their ancestors and elders past and present. The University of Waterloo's main campus is situated on the Haldeman Tract, so that's the land that was granted to the Six Nations that includes 6 miles on either side of the Grand River. At the University of Waterloo, our active work towards reconciliation takes place across our campuses through research, learning, teaching, and community building, and is coordinated within the Office of Indigenous Relations. So many of you might be quite familiar with the University of Waterloo. If you've joined us in a previous Future Ready Workforce Series webinar, you've probably seen this slide before. It's really just intended to highlight a few things that make our university and our co-op program special. The University of Waterloo was the first higher education institution in Canada to offer the cooperative model of education, and we now run the world's largest program of its kind, with 25,000 students participating in 120 academic programs and working in a global network of over 9,300 employers each year. And of course, Waterloo is home to the WorkLearn Institute. The WorkLearn Institute is the world's only research and education center focused on understanding the role of work-integrated learning in talent development. So at WorkLearn, we study the conditions to make work-integrated learning work for all of us, for students, for higher education institutions, and for yourself as employers. And we share what we learn in our research through the development of resources and toolkits and through webinars like this one. We're really proud to be the host of the Future Ready Workforce Series, which launched 3 years ago now. And we look forward to bringing you additional insights on how you can attract and retain top diverse talent through work-integrated learning in the months and years ahead. And now it's my pleasure to introduce you to our 2 special guest speakers, 2 of our WorkLearn research assistants and recent graduates from Waterloo's co-op program, Anushka Kuwar and Veronica Nihosan. These 2 young stars, and you'll see, will share both our research findings and then also some of their experiences as co-op students to help give a face and some context to the research. So really quickly, here is our high-level agenda for today. We'll talk a little bit about the importance of building inclusive workplaces, and particularly from a work-integrated learning perspective. Then we'll share some of the findings from our recent research, and Anushka and Veronica will, as I just said, contextualize those findings in the co-op student experience. From there, we'll provide you with a couple of actionable strategies, some of which you can implement immediately to make a difference in the work-integrated learning experiences of students from equity-deserving groups. And to wrap up, we'll share some next steps in our research as a research team, and then together as a community, including how you can get involved. So you might be quite familiar with the terms equity, diversity, and inclusion, but I think it's always important to take a minute to ground ourselves in the definitions so that we're all on the same page as we move forward. So equity refers to the fair and respectful treatment of all employees, regardless of their identity, background, or circumstances. And the concept of equity recognizes that some employees face more barriers and disadvantages than others and seeks to address those inequalities by providing everyone with the resources and the opportunities that they need to succeed. So equity doesn't mean treating everyone the same, but rather giving people what they need to achieve their full potential. Diversity is the presence and the representation of different identities, perspectives, and experiences in our workforce. So diversity encompasses various aspects of human difference, such as race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, age, disability or ability status, religion, culture, language, and more. And diversity enriches our collective knowledge, our creativity, and our innovation, and challenges us to really learn from and to appreciate our differences as humans. Inclusion is the active and intentional involvement and empowerment of every employee in the workplace, regardless of their diversity. So inclusion means creating a sense of belonging, respect, and value for everyone, and ensuring that every employee can participate and contribute to their fullest. Inclusion doesn't mean ignoring or erasing differences, but rather celebrating and leveraging them for the benefit of everyone. So if you're joining us today, I hope that you've already spent some time to think about and to learn some of the many benefits of having strong EDI policies and practices within your organization. We'll just take a quick minute to identify a couple of them, particularly ones that relate to the research findings today. So EDI policies and practices can help you broaden your talent pool. By prioritizing EDI in hiring, you're going to have a more expansive pool of candidates that allows for a wider range of skills, experiences, and perspectives. And we'll share some techniques on how you might do that later on. Of course, as we've already discussed, increased engagement. So a diverse and inclusive workforce fosters a sense of belonging and value among employees that leads directly to engagement, motivation, and productivity. And an organization with strong EDI policies and practices would see a reduction in bias and stereotype in the workplace that can help to create a more fair and respectful workplace for all of us. So strong EDI contributes to retention, a critical challenge for all of us, and a commitment to EDI contributes significantly to an organization's reputation. And this is something that our students at Waterloo have told us explicitly that they are looking for, and we'll share a little bit more about that later as well. And of course, there are many, many bottom line outcomes associated with improving your EDI efforts. So these are some benefits that are listed by accessibleemployers.ca, which has some great resources on it. And they list just a few: improved productivity, as we've already discussed, that a diverse workforce is 2 times as likely to meet or to exceed financial targets. Some really critical components in our world of work these days: diverse workforces are 6 times more likely to be innovative and 6 times more likely to effectively anticipate change. When it comes to work integrated learning, we know that many of you look to WIL programs like Waterloo's Co-op to find bright, young, and diverse talent. And there is some research to show that when it's done well, work integrated learning can lead to improved employment outcomes for students from equity deserving groups, including things like a reduction or even a removal of a salary gap that is traditionally associated with identity. So work integrated learning can be a very powerful equalizer. But in order to achieve these outcomes, a broader, more diverse, innovative, productive workforce for you, and stronger employment outcomes for our students, it's imperative that we create meaningful and inclusive work integrated learning experiences for them while they're students. And we know that, quite frankly, that's not happening in many instances for many students right now. Just to put some numbers around that, these are some recent statistics from our colleagues at the Higher Education Quality Council of Ontario. And they did a large study looking at some of the barriers towards inclusivity faced by various equity deserving groups. And these numbers are not surprising. They're representative of what we see of a lot of people from equity deserving groups face in the work world more broadly, but they really do help to give a sense as to some of the challenges that young, in many instances, vulnerable students might be facing as they're exploring their education and their career options. And there's a real opportunity for us to come together to close these gaps. So when we embarked on this research project at Waterloo, we did a review of the existing literature, what was kind of out there right now, to understand the challenges that were faced by work integrated learning students from equity deserving groups here in Canada. And to be honest, at the time, this was about a year and a half ago that we started to conceptualize this project, there wasn't a lot. So there had been studies done in countries like Australia and the US, and there were a few studies that provided some statistics about inequity for work integrated learning students. But there actually weren't any studies that involved directly talking to students and hearing in their voice and their words the challenges that they faced. So we did know from the research, for example, that students from equity deserving groups were less likely to participate in WIL. We knew that when they did, they often encountered discrimination, unequal resources, and underemployment. And we also knew that while there were many challenges that were specific to particular identities or equity deserving groups, there were some challenges that were common across these equity deserving groups. And so when we were trying to decide, well, where do we even begin with this critical question and with this research, we thought there's a real gap in that people are not talking to students and hearing their voices and their perspectives. So that's what we decided to do. We decided to bring students together and to ask them about the challenges and the barriers that they experienced towards achieving the goals that brought them to work integrated learning in the first place. And so we intentionally set up an exploratory study looking across equity deserving groups to see if we could identify some significant themes to direct us of where to even begin in solution generation. We know there are many definitions and understandings of equity deserving groups. So I just wanted to take a minute again to share the definitions that we used for our study. So we looked at the experiences of women, racialized peoples, members of the 2S LGBTQ+ communities, people living with disabilities. We looked at people that faced persecution as members of a racialized community who identify cultural and or who exercise cultural and or religious practices and any intersectionality of those identities. We had sketched out a research design that attempted to hear from our Indigenous groups in the land we now know as Canada, including First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities who are sovereign nations with inherent rights. And while not always included in studies of equity deserving groups, we did include international students in our study. And we knew from some of the existing research and from what we had heard from our students that international students often face many of the barriers that students from other equity deserving groups face. And so we wanted to learn more about their challenges. And what did we do? Well, to help answer our research question, we conducted interviews with 30 students who were willing to talk to us and just share more about their experiences. Importantly, we reached out to both current and former co-op students. So we wanted to hear the experiences of students that stayed in co-op and perhaps some that had left. And all of the interviewers who helped us out were at arm's length from the staff and the administration here at Waterloo. So we hired a number of researchers, including some students. Veronica was one of them, so that we could make sure that the students were really comfortable disclosing the challenges, even if they initially derived from staff engagement encounters policy practice here at Waterloo. So what we'll do in the next 25-30 minutes or so is share a couple of the research findings with you, along with that context and perspective from Anushka and Veronica. This shouldn't or couldn't be a comprehensive overview of the findings. There's simply too much to share and too much for us to address to attempt to do this in one session. And as you'll hear more about at the end of the session, we're really hoping that you'll partner with us in identifying solutions and really moving the needle on this together. So with that, I will pass things to Anushka, who will share some of the initial research findings and her experiences as a student.
Right. Thank you for that, Anne. So diving right into it, the first barrier discussed by students is the information gap. This gap refers to the discrepancy between EDG support policies and practices that exist and students' knowledge of them. There's a couple of quotes here that I think help to explain this further. A student living with disability says, "I don't know who to go to about that. I don't know if it's HR, and nobody's told me who I would talk to get accommodation." And another student says, "Harassment and discrimination aren't even reported. It's like, oh, I experienced this, but I don't know who to go to. Who's going to listen to this?" The point these quotes drive home is that very often students don't know about the existence of support policies or where and how to obtain the accommodations that they need. Beyond a lack of awareness, students also reported a lack of guidance and information provided by the university and their employer. What's important to note here is that very often these policies exist and there are structures in place to accommodate student needs, but very often students are simply unaware and they don't know about them. And this lack of knowledge is exactly what the information gap refers to, the fact that even though supports exist, students don't know about them. Another aspect of the information barrier being reported by students is the mismatch in understanding, which refers to a difference in students' expectation of how they wanted to be accommodated and the accommodations that were offered, essentially speaking to a discrepancy between student expectations and their reality. Here, the research highlighted that despite willingness to help, sometimes there's a lack of understanding of how best to address and accommodate student concerns in the way that best suits their needs. Next slide. In order to fully understand the student experience here, it's important to first discuss the ways in which the context, experience, and capacity of a co-op student is different from that of a new grad or a full-time employee. As a new student coming into the co-op program, not only are they trying to understand the application, recruitment, and work term processes, but they're also trying to adjust to a new city, keep up with academics, and overall just settle into a very overwhelming undergraduate experience. And through all this newness, the best way to set students up for success is to provide them with all of the information that they'll need to successfully integrate. But what I remember, my biggest concern as a new co-op student when I was first applying was not just a lack of clarity, but also a question of who I should go to for help. There often isn't a clear delineation between what falls under the purview of the university and the employer, and this can cause students to feel somewhat caught in the middle and unsure of who to ask for the help that they need. And beyond that, asking for help and then being bounced around from person to person looking for someone that can actually help you can be incredibly frustrating. And this experience of having a concern but not knowing where to go to for help can cause not just confusion, but also a sense of powerlessness. Being an international student myself, I can personally speak to a feeling of being very disoriented by this complicated system. And it can be extremely discouraging to come into a new environment and feel like you don't know what's going on because you don't know how to ask for help or who to go to. And sometimes when students ask for help, they can be met with a sense of, as a student, it's your job to know this already. And this can be even more stressful. feeling like asking for help is a reflection on your knowledge and your ability to have done your due diligence. A desire to avoid the stress can cause students to be hesitant in reaching out, and they lose the opportunity to access resources and the support that they need, which sheds light on why this information gap is such a significant barrier for students from EDGs. Next slide. Another barrier discussed by EDG students was disclosure, or the act of being open about their identity and the issues that are associated with it, such as stigma, prejudice, and discrimination. There's a couple quotes here that highlight this barrier. A student with Down syndrome says, "I don't really want to tell many people because based on my experience in life, there's a chance that people involved will lose all respect for me because I'm a disabled person and start treating me differently." Another student says that I believe interviews were a bit more challenging to make a good impression on because of my identification. These quotes talk about implicit discrimination based on identity, and they're so powerful because they encompass exactly why most EDG students are scared of disclosure. And it's because they feel like people will see them and treat them differently once their identity is shared and known. And this is a significant barrier because this fear of discrimination is not just about day-to-day interaction, but also impacts their experience with the recruitment and employment process. Many students reported a belief that disclosing their EDG identity would cause them to be excluded from and limit their access to good jobs and employment. Fear of discrimination also caused students to worry that disclosure would not only open them up to scrutiny, but also complicate their relationships with prospective and current coworkers and employers, causing them to interact and socialize less with the people around them. And this can also have an impact on student mental health. Some students can also internalize this prejudice, with some reported instances of clear discrimination against their identity, but where students brushed it off as something they had come to expect. And it's not hard to imagine that this can influence the way student mental health and the way they think and feel about themselves. And lastly, these experiences instill students with a sense of wariness about disclosing their identity, with many reporting that they prefer to mask or conceal their identity in a workplace. They reported that this pressure to mask was implicit, but nonetheless was perceived as discriminatory. This masking can cause students to censor themselves and parts of their identity in order to protect themselves from the potential consequences of disclosure. Next slide. We talked about why students choose to mask their identity in order to protect themselves. However, by masking and self-censoring, students can also close themselves off from some of the most advantageous parts of the co-op experience. For me, part of the benefit of the co-op process was that it offers students opportunities to create networks and connections, both personal and professional, that can benefit them in years to come. But it's difficult for students to make these authentic connections and networks when they're actively hiding and censoring parts of their identity from the people around them, costing them not only valuable connections and networks, but also potentially adversely affecting their work term experience. Further, for students that have moved cities or even countries to attend university, such as international students, this can have an even greater impact. To these students that are physically cut off from their old safe spaces and comfort zones back home through distance, this lack of socialization and inability to form new connections can further isolate students, causing stress and a significant impact on mental health. And lastly, for some students, there is more pressure than usual to succeed academically and professionally. For example, international students who are paying very high tuition fees, or students that are financially supporting themselves through co-op or paying their tuition through co-op. For these students, co-op is a very high stakes situation. There's a lot riding on it for them. And this can make that pressure to mask their identity and hide themselves in order to protect themselves from discrimination can feel even higher, adding to the stress they experience and sort of explaining why the disclosure and the associated stigma is such a significant barrier for EDG students. And now I'm going to pass it over to Veronica to discuss a few other barriers that students have experienced while going through the co-op process.
Thank you so much, Anushka. As my colleague mentioned, identity concerns is a core theme in the research, and I think this comes up particularly in the recruitment stage. There was a student in the research who had mentioned that they really appreciated when employers have a diversity statement or something in the job post. And that made them feel really comfortable. But other students had also said that even when there's a statement about welcoming diversity and inclusion, they didn't always feel included if they didn't see their particular equity deserving group represented in the posting. Additionally, the research also highlights some concerns surrounding interview accessibility, which I think can be summed up very well by a participant quote here from a student living with a physical disability. They said, they're starting to do interviews at the Tatum Center again with actual mobility issues. That is a lot harder than going to a Zoom interview. Because what should be for a normal person a 10-minute walk, it's not a 10-minute walk for me, right? With COVID ending, a lot of the great accessibility things, at least on my end with respect to digital communication becoming available, suddenly now feels gone. And I think this quote really highlights a key thing about this job mode conversation that's happening a lot post-COVID. For some people, it's a preferential thing of doing hybrid to online to in person. Some people don't get a choice. Students don't get a choice, and it's particularly hard on people with a disability or are a part of other equity deserving groups because it can make them even more visible and susceptible to discrimination. Next slide. On a personal note, I found that in my co-op experience, employers were not very keen on me asking for accommodations, especially like at the interview stage. And I felt really nervous about it near the beginning of my co-op experience. And then near the end, still feeling really anxious about it. I have a learning disability, which impacts specifically my short-term memory. So I recall asking an employer if they could share the written interview questions as they asked it to me orally. They promptly said no. Their reason being that they don't do that for anybody else. And that was really frustrating for me to hear because I think for a lot of people, with a disability or not, disclosed or not, knowing what the interview questions are when they're written can be very helpful. And it really made me think, okay, but why is it a secret? For my discipline, I was studying environmental studies. There wasn't any particular reason that I could think of why they did that. So I encourage people to think about why we have some of the systems in place that we do. The second thing I want to talk about is surrounding this idea of the job posting, not sharing everything that a student may need to know about the organization. When it comes to EDI statements, I can say personally, it doesn't do anything for me because I've had employers with amazing EDI statements that didn't accommodate me the way I needed. Also, I found it challenging during my co-op experience when I had an employer that had an EDI statement and I wanted to ask about it, but they didn't allocate time in the interview for me to ask any questions to them. It really set a tone and dynamic for me that my personal needs wouldn't be appreciated or welcome in the workplace. And I think that's really tough because sometimes that's not true. So I really encourage you to think about how much time you allocate to having your students ask you guys questions about the culture, about many different things relating to things inside the job description. Next slide, please. Another barrier brought up in the research relates to EDI policies. And I want to start off this section by sharing a quotation by a participant who had a very tough experience. They said, generally speaking, it just felt like I had a problem and no one was really quite sure how to address it. So they kind of just gave me the answer of try to look towards the future for hope, or like, yeah, basically just keep looking forward, keep moving forward. And that's what I did. And it didn't work. This was a student living with a disability. In the research, several participants discussed how their employers' lack of diversity, inclusion, and equity policies made them feel not only less content, but less comfortable at work. And many participants suggested that this was due to the employer's lack of training, and how having more training would have made them better poised to support them in their specific concerns regarding their equity deserving group in the workplace. Some students even indicated that this led to an unwillingness for the employer to provide any accommodation despite appeals from the co-op staff. And some even suspected that this led to their ongoing discrimination and sometimes microaggressions during their co-op experience. Next slide. I really want to emphasize the importance of doing your EDI homework before the student is there. In my co-op experience, I had 5 co-ops. In every single one of them, I was the only Black person. I've been in big organizations, I've been in small organizations, I've been in organizations with 25 stories in the building. Most of the time, I was also the only racialized person on their team. I did have employees who were very keen on EDI. However, how they approached it put me in a very uncomfortable position as a student, especially as a student who was starting off their co-op experience. I didn't have as much confidence in pointing out things that made me uncomfortable because I was afraid of how they would rank me, how I would be treated over the course of that 4 months. I remember I had a employer who wanted me to explain to them how not to harm people like me and people who look like me. And although I loved that they cared, it was a lot of emotional labor that I wasn't paid for, on top of labor that I signed a contract to do. And I found that to be unfair, especially because I know that I had colleagues who were also in the co-op experience, who were not a part of equity deserving groups, who did not have to ration their energy for the emotional labor on top of their actual labor for their contract. So please don't put your students through that. If you think about EDI stuff beforehand, you'll at least have some more tools, and we'll talk about tools moving forward. Next slide, please.
Thank you so much, Anushka and Veronica, for sharing those research findings and then really being candid and open and sharing your experiences as students. So we've identified a number, and as I said at the beginning of this presentation, not all of the barriers that were identified in the research. And I think we have a couple of actionable strategies that we can share with our employer representatives now. So can I pass it back to you, Veronica, to dive into those strategies?
So happy to. I am very fond of the University of Waterloo Employer Impact Award on Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. I was on their panel in 2021 to decide the winners. And I think exploring that might help some of the people on this webinar. The strategies that we're about to discuss are strategies and initiatives that have also been implemented by the winners and some of our honorable mentions. And it might give you some inspiration for what you can do moving forward. One of the things that is highly recommended is this idea of unconscious bias awareness. Now, as we had discussed earlier in the presentation, we know that over 66% of Waterloo students said that they wanted an employer that values EDI. And we also know that there is knowledge that we take for granted because we're not in everybody's shoes. So when we consider tools that help us identify our implicit biases, such as the implicit association test, which we can share as one of our resources, it helps us understand some of the privileges that we have that maybe we didn't know about, and how our social location, whether that be class, race, ethnicity, so many other things, inform the lens that we have. Now, if we want to be more accommodating to a diversity of experiences, one of the things that we can really do is be more transparent about processes in general, be more transparent about timelines and expectations. And this is not just for, during a performance evaluation feedback thing, which is helpful, but it's also during the whole co-op experience, especially during the selection process, which I'll talk a bit more on the next slide. If you want to go to the next slide, thank you. Here's a quote from a marginalized student. They said, "It feels like it was just quite anxiety inducing because there's no feedback from employers, especially post-interview, for why you weren't chosen for a position. It just feels like students are often left in the dust, put into a position of, I don't know why this is happening, but it's happening." When I reflect on this quote, I think it's very important to understand that many of these students from equity deserving groups know what it feels like to be discriminated against. And even though their non-selection for a role might have nothing to do with discriminatory practices or anything like that, not knowing still makes the student wonder, was I not selected because I wasn't qualified, or was I not selected because English isn't my first language, or I have a very physical disability, or is it because of what I look like, or things like that? And so sharing feedback not only quells concerns, but it's so constructive to the students because they can take that, they have something where they can lean into their agency and just become a better candidate for the future, either for you, for someone else, and they feel more confident. The other thing that's important to think about is when we're providing feedback, it's not just about doing it, it's about how we do it. We can consider their personal goals that they are thinking about. We can think about their learning styles. We can think about cultural nuances. I highly recommend, once again, that you look into the University of Waterloo Employer Impact Award on EDI, because there's some fantastic examples of winners and honorable mentions doing just that. I'm going to pass it on to Anne.
Thank you so much, Veronica. Just doing the little Zoom transition there, everyone. So I'd like to close up with a couple of additional tips. And our next one is to demonstrate your commitment to equity, diversity, and inclusion explicitly and frequently. And you've already heard about the proportion of our students that have indicated that an employer that prioritizes EDI is very important or essential to them. And they're looking for those indications in every step of their engagement with you. So we've had a little bit of discussion about job descriptions and some of the challenges of boilerplate inclusivity statements in job descriptions. We've done a lot of research on this in WorkLearn. And one of the things that we've seen is that students are looking for value statements in your job descriptions, but it isn't enough, as Veronica said, to just have that boilerplate text in there. They're looking in the job description for indications of how you live those values. So include your EDI statement, but then include references to the programs, to the resources that you have in place to support students. I'd like to pass along another really simple tip for onboarding. Before the student arrives, before the first day of the work term, send a message to that student with information and resources about the first day of work. This is a really, really simple thing to do, but you'd be surprised how many do not and how highly effective it can be when it's done right. So it can include all sorts of things like dress code, parking and bus route information. Here's a couple great restaurants you might want to check out near our location. But it's also a really great place to remind students about the resources that you have in place to support EDI during their work term experience. They may not have considered it, or they may not have put thought around it before the work term starts. And it's a really good way to make sure that they know what's available. And of course, students may need to be comfortable enough before they are willing or able to disclose. And so it's really valuable when you think about the short period of time that a student is with you to have reminders throughout the work term that those resources are available so they know where they are when they need them. And I just want to kind of encapsulate this tip with this quote from one of our research participants. They wrote, "The organization was very progressive inside their job description. So when I was applying, it did feel like I could probably feel safe and comfortable here. And then when I actually was on the job, it did seem that way as well. And it was pretty diverse in the sense of the different workers. There's men and women of all different ethnicities and sexual orientations and everything." So here we have an example where the student is looking for those indicators in the job description, saw them, and then found an organization that lived out those values where they could feel comfortable and safe to be their authentic self. Our next tip has to do with training and development. So when we asked our students, they told us that above all else, they are looking for employers who provide training and development opportunities. So that is our top tip on Gen Z, full stop. But it's also something that we would ask you to think about with an EDI lens. So there is research to show that when students from equity deserving groups are paired with mentors with similar lived experience, so many of the barriers that we've identified can be mitigated or overcome through the trust and the dynamics that are established in that relationship. And building that network for your students, introducing them to mentors and colleagues broadly throughout your organization is a very powerful way to build organizational commitment with your students and increase the chances of them wanting to become full-time members of your team. This actually relates to some other research that we did that said workplace friendships and the connections that students make with full-time members within your organization are one of the most important factors and have a significant influence on that idea of organizational commitment, and that this is a place that I can see myself working long-term. So if you can, consider launching mentorship programs pairing students from equity deserving groups with experienced team members, and communicate the purpose and the benefits of that mentorship program, talking about training and professional development. If that's not possible, think about other ways that you can intentionally and explicitly connect students across your organization. If you have the HR department, arrange a session for all of your students to meet with the HR rep to, again, open up the understanding of what resources might be there for students who are and aren't ready to disclose, and facilitate introductions beyond that student's work team so that students can build that network and see themselves within your organization. Our last tip for you is to remember that we as higher education institutions are here as partners. We're here to help. We have lots of resources to help you connect your talent strategy to our students, and we are genuinely interested in establishing and strengthening our partnerships with you. So if you're looking for guidance on a job description, on an onboarding program, on your talent strategy, particularly with an EDI lens, continue to engage with your higher education partners and really start that conversation. And we do hope that those of you that are with us today are willing to stay engaged in this specific conversation so we can really work together and make some changes. So with that, let's talk a little bit about what next steps might look like on our end. So we do have some resources for you today that we've put together. As we said, within higher ed, we've been working really hard to think about how we can help you support our students. And so we've given you some resources, some research in the document that Carrie just posted. We also want to announce that throughout 2024, we'll be running a series focused on supporting inclusive work integrated learning experiences for diverse students. Stay tuned, we'll be in touch really soon with speakers, students, other employers. But right now we have a plan of topics that include accommodations for work integrated learning students, supporting racialized students, building inclusive experiences for 2S LGBTQ+ WIL students, and recruiting and supporting diverse learners. And our research isn't done either. So right now we have a team of student researchers, including Anushka and Veronica and a few others. And we're really starting to shift the conversation from barriers to solutions. So those students are interviewing other students from equity deserving groups to hear some best case, some good practice examples, and to really hear student ideas for solution generation. From there, our next step is to bring together some virtual and in-person communication brainstorming sessions to collectively devise solutions and implementation strategies together. And that's where we're hoping you can help. So if you are interested in participating in one of those sessions, we've just launched a poll. Please say yes. It's no pressure, but if this is something that you're interested in, we would love to get your contact information, and then we'll keep you in the loop. At this point in time, we're expecting to have those sessions in late spring and early summer. And again, we'll bring together students, faculty, staff, and employers to say, what can we do together? So I see the polls up. We've already got lots of people saying yes. That's fantastic. Thank you so much. And with that, I think we're on time. We've got a few minutes for some Q&A. I see there's a couple of questions that have been put in the chat already. So let's move to the Q&A, invite Veronica and Anushka back on stage, and we'll dive into the questions. Actually, as I do that, I should say a giant thank you to all of you for joining us today, and a huge thank you to Anushka and Veronica again for sharing their experiences with us. So are we ready for some questions? Yes. Okay, let's see what we've got here. I know there were a couple of administrative questions, sort of. So Samantha asks, what compensation was offered to the participants to honor their lived experience and expertise? Yeah, that's a really important question, Samantha. So as Veronica said, it's really critical that we don't ask people to do unpaid labor in this space. We reached out to every undergraduate student at the University of Waterloo that had ever been engaged in a co-op program. We had 1,400 of them respond to us with a willingness to participate. In that, there was, I think it was a $20 gift card. There's a bit of a balance in that it is a ethics recruitment protocol, and we have to be careful that we're not giving compensation that isn't reflective of what student co-op salary might be. So that's kind of why the $20 was offered to the participants. And then I see there's a follow-up question. How did you identify the randomly selected students as being from EDGs? So another really great question. When we sent the message out, we asked students if they self-identified as belonging to an equity deserving group and asked them to tell us which equity deserving groups they belonged to. And then we had this giant spreadsheet of people that were willing to talk to us, and we did random stratified samples to try and ensure that we were speaking to students from a number of equity deserving groups.
Can I add something, Anne?
Yeah, please.
Also, I think it's important to also recognize that these students who were asked these questions, they were allowed to not share that. Like they knew that they could share as much or as little as they wanted to. So if they didn't want to disclose something, we could be like, hey, or are you disabled? Or like, it wasn't anything like that. It was very much what they were comfortable with sharing.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. And I think we were trying to be really careful and thoughtful in setting the conditions for comfort. I think I mentioned that we didn't have staff from the university conduct the interviews because we knew that that might create conditions whereby we weren't hearing challenges that were created by the university. So I have a question here. So maybe I'll see if Anushka and Veronica have anything to add to it. What are your best tips to encourage hiring managers to follow through / support hiring diverse candidates and making accommodations? How should we get them to care about this? So I think I'm reading this as, how do we get hiring managers to care about making these accommodations and the value supporting diverse candidates and that kind of thing? Any thoughts on that one?
I spoke a lot. Anushka, do you want to? I'm happy to jump in, but I want to give you an opportunity to add your thoughts.
I think the first thing that comes to my mind in terms of, I think one thing to understand when considering this perspective for students is just to understand that as a co-op student, your perspective is just so different, and the experience of a co-op student and their capacity and what they're going through, it's all very different than what you might find in an employer that's maybe just freshly graduated or that's working full-time. And I think that's just a very important thing to consider, is just that openness to understanding that there's a lot going on behind the scenes for co-op students that maybe is not visible. And there's a lot of sort of behind the scenes that can be making it difficult. And I think that's sort of important to consider as a general thing. Specifically, Veronica, did you have anything to add?
I think what you said is very true. The other thing I would add, near the end of my I think near the beginning of my co-op experience, when I first got co-ops, I was very anxious to say what I needed, and near the end, I stopped caring as much, and I was like, well, I'm going to be gone in 4 months, so I will tell you everything that I think is wrong with this organization. If it's even just that, like the stakes are so low as a co-op student for me, because I'm like, I was like, I'm gonna leave. But also for on the employer side, if you're gonna hire someone for 4 months, like it would be great if they told you everything that you needed to work on. Like it's different than if you hire a permanent person and you want them to tell I had less skin in the game than someone who would have been a permanent long-term hire. So I think that's also like, if you want honesty and you actually want to change, like that can be helpful.
I just wanted to jump in because what you said, Veronica, actually aligns with research that was done at another university, not ours, but was looking very specifically at students that with disabilities that required accommodations. And what they learned is that through participation in co-op, students gain comfort with disclosing and gain comfort in asking for what they need. And what we want to do as organizations is think about how we can do that without the pain of having to stumble into that confidence. So what can we do as organizations to open the door for students? And I'm just going to pick up on Anushka's earlier comment, because this is more very specifically on work integrated learning. But to answer your question, Taylor, I think it really is regrounding yourself in where students are. They are taking classes as they're applying for multiple jobs, and some of them have never had a job before, and they're in a new country, in a new city, in a new education system. And so the kindness of the clarity, the transparency in a job description, in an interview, in making sure students have time to ask questions, as Veronica suggested, can be one of the most powerful things that you can do. And if you can just remind yourself of that kind of level of development, it could go a long way. Okay, I see there is a question. I'll maybe take this very quickly, but I want to turn it to Anushka and Veronica after. So for a company that is looking to prioritize hiring from equity deserving communities, is there a way to communicate this in our job posting, or to identify if a student is from one community? Can this be identified prior to selecting interviews? I think what we want to do is to think about how we can build up strong EDI policies in organizations so that your organization is set to have all employees thrive. I would say that there are sometimes concerns with job descriptions that are very explicitly seeking to hire students from particular equity deserving groups when we don't know of a commitment to equity, diversity, and inclusion. And so we are certainly willing to have conversations with our employers to better understand why you are looking for students from particular equity deserving groups, what kinds of resources and supports you have in place. But I would just say, maybe from a higher education institution perspective, that's one of the maybe lenses or cautions. We have to be very careful that we're not putting students into situations where they are just being hired so that they are meeting a diversity target and they are not being supported. I don't know if Veronica and Anushka have any comments to add on that one.
Anushka, do you want to go?
Yeah, I can talk about this a little bit. I think that as an international student during the co-op process, I've had a few experiences where there's some jobs that I'm simply just not able to apply to as an international student. And that's sometimes it's for reasons I don't fully understand, but that's happened quite a few times during the co-op process. But there's also the flip side of it, like Anne said, where you're hiring people just to show that, oh, we're hiring people. And I think what has been really helpful while I've been applying to the co-op process is those conversations around, well, if you're saying that you want to hire from particular EDGs, why is that? Why is that important to you? And sort of that communication of, I don't just want to be a token in your organization. I want to know how it is that my unique perspective is sort of what you're looking for, and how I can contribute to your organization and the work that you do in a way that honors where I'm from and my lived experience. And I think sort of just making that clear in the sort of even in the interviews, of just sort of communicating why that's important to you, and how is it that and the supports that are in place to sort of support and bolster your student as they're going through that process at your organization. I hope that makes sense.
I know we're at time, basically. I have one more thing to add. Also, understanding that there's a pathway for the student to possibly stay. I've seen employers hire a lot of we're looking for EDG groups, and they'll hire them and they'll only keep them as co-op students. And then they're in and they're out, and that hurts. And so now when I see statements where we're looking for, Black racialized students, I'm running for the hills because I've been traumatized. So like what Anushka said, like understanding that like you practice your values, not just for the students, for everyone in your organization, is so important. Like it quells my concerns.
Thank you. Thank you so much. There are more questions. This always happens. We can never get through them all. Let's go to the next slide. We'll do a quick little, we really value you joining us. We hope you stay connected. We hope you find our research valuable. We do have an entire conference for our employers coming up on March 7th. So go to Hire Waterloo Employer Impact Conference. You can find out more about that. And we are so grateful to all of you for your willingness to engage in genuine conversation on this critically important topic. Have a great rest of your day, everyone. Thank you so much.